Welcome everyone to the first Fund webinar of 2024. Today we will be chatting about all the things related to how you as a startup founder, finance leader, business leader, and investor can master unit economics. I'm Gantare from Fund, and before we get started, I'd like to give you some handy tips to get most out of this session. The session is for you, and throughout the session, feel free to drop your questions. You can do that by dropping your questions in the chat window or Q&A, as well as share thoughts. And also, we do have emojis available, so feel free to express your emotions for the comments or the questions. Just a note, the session was made possible by Orbital X, and it's being recorded. It will be shared afterward and available to the public on our YouTube channel. Without further ado, please allow me to introduce you to Joyce McKenzie-Liu, modern CFO, founder, and CEO of Fund.
Thank you, Guntar. Just a quick note about Fund. We provide fractional CFO services to SaaS and software businesses across Europe. Super fortunate to have the first webinar of the year. And I think there's been over 90 registrants, which I'm like, wow, so impressed that people actually are interested about unit economics and finance in particular, because this is a topic that's very dear and near to me, mostly because a lot of the businesses that we've worked with, particularly at the early stage in the Series A and B stage, often I find, the concept of unit economics to begin with is just not well understood and far less even well applied in practice. So I wanted to have this opportunity to actually share some insights from experts in this space, from Shelley and Johan, because over the years, we've had lots of discussions and debates on this particular topic. So before we get started, let me first do a proper introduction. Shelley Perry is an advisor, board member, operator turned investor, formerly at Insight Partners. She's had a wealth of experience. If you go on her LinkedIn, you'll be super impressed by all the big companies and small companies she's worked with over the years. Johan Jensen is a fractional CPO and has previously scaled product teams at GoStudent, Grover, Hilti, and was also a founder himself at Sleep Out. Welcome.
Welcome.
So Shelley and Johan, maybe just to kick things off a little, from your perspective, what does unit economics even mean, and why should anyone care?
Johan, go ahead.
Okay, cool. So I feel privileged to be here with both of you because your backgrounds are impressive and you're finance people. And if you asked me 12 years ago if I'd be on stage with finance people, I'd be like, there's no way. So I started out in conflict resolution, working with chimpanzees in West Africa, worked for the UN for a while, So anyway, for me, so unit economics is really simple, right? It's like the costs and what is it costing you and what are you making from a transaction or a customer, right? You can look at it from different angles, from like an asset angle, from a transaction angle, from a customer angle, but basically it boils down to understanding the cost to acquire a customer, and then how much is that customer going to make you, right? So it's like CAC, LTV generally. That's kind of in a nutshell. That's my very simplistic non-finance approach to unit economics. But I've done my research now, so I can tell you over the last 12 years, I've started to understand actually what you guys are talking about.
I have a finance background and a software background. So I have my undergrad and served as an accountant before I actually went and became very enamored with the whole software world and then SaaS world. So for those finance people in the audience, the way I think about unit economics is in the hardware space or in the physical goods space. It's pretty easy to determine unit economics. It's the cost of that unit. How much does it cost to produce? What did it cost? How much does it cost to store it on the shelf? How much does it cost to put it, distribute it in whatever way that you're going to sell it? So the unit is very easy when it's a physical good. If it's my readers, this is the unit. What's difficult, I think, to understand is how does that translate to software? When we used to deliver software on CDs, it was pretty easy. You delivered the CD and the CD was the unit. But then as we moved into SaaS and it became software as a service, how do we then start to carve out what is a unit in that context? Because it's quite dynamic. And I think that's really where I'm hoping that when we're going through these conversations, we can kind of help you understand a little bit about that. And then, of course, like the cost of selling and how customers are using it is a key concept. But think of it as in a physical good, you can understand the unit. Now, how do we start applying that to software as a service? And how, because you can do it. It's just that people sometimes can't get their head around it. So
yeah, when was the first time you came across the concept of unit economics, and what was kind of like the aha moment?
Right. So yeah. So I think my introduction to the concept was so we were scaling a marketplace for accommodation in Africa called sleepout.com. And we were adding a lot of supply in terms of accommodation on the platform. And we kind of had this mentality of like, well, if we build it, if we had all the supply, people will book the accommodation. And, you know, it was very simplistic. We were just filling empty beds. And then one of our Series A investors hinted to me that I should be looking at unit economics. And I was like, what do you mean? What is that? He wouldn't tell me. He said I had to look it up. And so then I started to understand, okay, this is how you scale this model predictably, right? Because then you model out kind of what it's going to cost you to acquire customers, whether it's through performance marketing, brand marketing, whatever kind of like acquisition channel you want. And then since then, it's kind of, you know, obviously it's just become part of like every day, right? Like in every startup. But what I've noticed is like a lot of people in product haven't really gone through that process, right? Because I think a lot of product people are often put in a position where they don't have to think about the P&L. They don't have to think about a lot of the budgeting stuff, right? I think like modern product people certainly do. But in some of like, especially like earlier stage startups, like the product people aren't really empowered to make financial decisions, right? They're just building out features, right? And I think in my view, and I think this kind of dovetails with the way you see things, Joyce, and I think Shelley as well, is like a modern product person, a modern finance person is kind of thinking more holistically, how do I work cross-functionally? And so unit economics really becomes like that bridge between the product and finance language, or the language, you know, that you can start to discuss like your respective domains.
And Shelley, you've worked really closely with like early stage startups and scale ups, and actually shared a story about Chargebee and Krishna in their early days when they were building out that company. Like, could you tell us a bit more about what are some of the challenging decisions and trade-offs that founders and also product leaders or any business leader need to understand in order to help continue growing a business? And what are some of the common pitfalls that happen along that journey?
So I kind of break it down into, when I think of the scale up stage, and I really have passion around the scale up stage of growth, I kind of break it into 3 stages: early stage scale up, mid stage, and kind of late stage getting ready for, you know, kind of the profitability, going public. So in the early stages of scale up, I think one of the things that you have to look at is as you kind of hit that product market fit. And I always say people can define product market fit in the rearview mirror, because you don't really realize it's happening until you kind of stop and look back. And in the early stage, you are doing what you do as a founder or scaling up, and that's you're listening to the customers and you're figuring out, oh, we can do that, right? As a founder or an early stage salesperson, you're listening to what they want and you're like, oh, it's SaaS, it's software, I can make it do whatever I want. And so you say yes to a lot of things. And what happens is by the time you get to that early stage of scale, kind of post product market fit, you know, maybe you have, you know, depending on your ASP or depending on your sales price, it's a different stage, but you have all this revenue. So let's just say you have 5 million in revenue. Embedded in that 5 million revenue is your product market fit for maybe 60% of it. And then 40% are things that you've tried along the way and you've said yes to because you need revenue, because it was like the software can do it. And I think when you start getting into unit economics is you have to take that, you know, 5 million of revenue and you have to start breaking it down into groupings of cohorts of how your customers are using the platform. And then that in and of itself becomes different units, because not everyone is using it the same way, especially in the early stages. And I think one of the things that you have to do is go, look, we may have half of our revenue or 3/4 of our revenue using the platform this way, and we have another, 1/3 using it this way. And if you can wrap your mind around the fact that those are two different units, right, which is conceptual, but they're two different units, the way that those customers are going to want that platform to evolve is different because they're using it in different ways. And so you have to start looking at, what is it going to cost me to evolve the platform from this direction or this direction? And you have to make a choice as you're scaling of which one you're going to invest in right now. And you do that by, what are the unit economics? How much is it going to cost me to add to this and sell more to this cohort versus this cohort right now? Because as you're scaling, you don't have enough resources or maturity to actually build out both. And if you try to build out both, you'll actually fail with both of them. So if you understand the unit economics of what it's going to cost you to kind of build this cohort out in the future or this cohort out in the future, you can then start to make prioritization decisions. And not making the choice and not understanding how much it's going to both cost you to build it and to sell it and to maintain it, without making those choices, you're actually leaving opportunity cost on the table. So I think in the early stages of scaling, the really important thing is to understand how much of that revenue is really in your sweet spot or product market fit, how much is outside of it or a second product market fit, and then start to look at the unit economics of breaking them down conceptually.
Can you give us an example? Oh, sorry. Finish.
I'll give you an example of, maybe a mid-stage, and you can apply it. And it's a very real example. So I was brought in to help a vertical, a SaaS solution that was vertical, that was really wanting to get ready for a major transaction or exit. The founder had gotten the first round of funding, and they really wanted to exit, but wanted to create value going forward by creating a major compelling event where then he could exit, and whatever the next set of investors would take it to the next level. And they had at that point 3 different products that were selling to very similar, the same industry, but very similar cohorts. And one of the things that we had to do was to figure out which of those cohorts, or which of those units, if you will, which of those products, which of those lines of businesses were going to provide the most growth right now. Because when you're exiting, you want, the growth trajectory, you want year-on-year growth. Often what's going to provide you the most growth right now isn't the one that's going to create you the most growth for the next investor, right? Because you need to be on the very beginning of a trajectory of a second product or thing that's going to actually provide value to the next. So as we started looking into all of the different products they were selling, although they didn't view it as different products. It was one P&L, it was one business unit, if you've worked for bigger companies. So it's all embedded in the same P&L, and you have to get into the detail of what's actually making up those numbers. And one of the things we were able to find is that, they were spending like 30% or 40% of their R&D dollars on one of the units or one of the products that was only contributing, a small portion to growth and a small portion to profitability. And so we had to make the decision, what if we stopped selling that? So we could redirect some of the marketing dollars to something else. What if we stopped selling, not end of support, but just stop actively selling it? And what if we stopped actively building it? And we redirected those dollars to marketing the thing that's going to sell the most to give us the most growth, and then moving dollars over to also invest in R&D and something that's actually going to provide the next investor value, right? So it's a little bit slower. So in that, you really have to get into the unit economics and break your business, which sometimes doesn't seem big enough to start putting into business units. You have to do it conceptually, and that's really where more like an FP&A skill comes in versus an accounting skill. But that FP&A can't work without like someone understanding the detail. So it's really understanding the trade-offs that you have in front of you that they don't surface that easily if you're just looking at the P&L, and if you're just looking individually at roadmaps and you're kind of and marketing spend or sales spend, and you're not kind of correlating it all together. Hopefully that good example.
Yeah, definitely. Johan, I think we also talked in the past about, I think for our product leader, I can imagine building different features, functionality, workflow, infra is always exciting. And I've always enjoyed working with product because they have such like the customer lens, but also often the 360 lens inside the business. Can you like share some stories or maybe examples of where perhaps there was conflict between the different teams and you had to make a decision that was in the best interest of ultimately not only the customers, but also the business holistically?
Yeah, yeah, one day I remember our CFO when I was at Grover, on all hands, he said, at a certain price, we have unlimited demand, right? And it's an obvious statement, of course, like if you're renting consumer electronics at a certain price, you have unlimited demand. But it actually got me to think around, okay, so we should be looking more deeply at like the different cohorts, like Shelley was saying, and which of those cohorts actually are the ones that are bringing us the most value, right? So we looked at actually the different use cases that are driving, because a lot of, my big realization was that like often finance speak in numbers, and you go through the exec meetings and you're running through the metrics, but there's often a lack of understanding of like what is driving those numbers, right? So starting from kind of that point of view, okay, so if you can price things properly, you can create enough demand. If you can understand what drives things, you can start to look at which cohorts make the most sense. So we actually developed, based on like the different use cases that people were using Grover for, we realized that actually the ones with the highest lifetime value were the rent to upgrade customers. So the ones that were renting and then upgrading. Obviously, Apple has figured this out as well, right? You get the new iPhone every year, every 2 years. You keep them in your lane, and their lifetime value kind of skyrockets. And so we started to focus on those customers. We called it the love maximization strategy, because we saw that actually. So initially, when I started with Grover, we had a 4-month average rental period. So averaging, I think it was about 70 euros on average, right, for 4 months. And as we started to focus on this love maximization strategy, we actually got the average rental period up to 12 months over the course of the next 18 months, right? So we went from 4 months to 12 months average rental, reducing churn dramatically, right? So, and the main thing is that by focusing on those rent to upgrade customers, we saw that churn just kind of, started to disappear or go very slowly. And then we also were able to upsell those rent to upgrade customers on other stuff as well, right? So I don't think so much it was necessarily a conflict as much it was about how do we work cross-functionally across the pricing and commercial teams, across the finance teams, across the product teams to kind of deliver this like coherent experience for the right segments, right? To what Shelley was saying. I mean, we had made other mistakes around like building products that also started to kind of like the vampire products, like the one Shelley was describing, that is just kind of eating into your business. But I think it really helps with kind of breaking it down. But I think it's a cross-functional task, right? It can't just be done by one part of the business. And I think that's where I think good product managers are able to kind of work across the business to kind of drive this. And I think unit economics is like a good place to start. I think like the unit economics model should be understood by a lot of the key players in the company. I think it's also kind of your special sauce. So, how much can you share that with the whole company? I don't know, maybe in Shelley's experience, I'd be curious, like, we were always very concerned about showing our unit economics model to the whole company because we didn't want that to get out to competitors.
I think that especially as you're in scaling up, it's that I don't know that it benefits sharing unit economics with the whole company if the company isn't. Not every single person, especially as you're scaling, is going to understand everything, right? And that if you try to help everybody understand everything, they don't have enough hours in the day. So I think one of the really big challenges of scaling, which is kind of outside of the scope of this discussion, is how much do you share at which level to still maintain transparency? And I think that sharing unit economics, there's other ways that you can talk about it to kind of give that transparency without kind of using, the more detailed technical terms that your C-suite or, your first and second level managers need to understand. So I think that certainly transparency is key to any kind of working within a scale-up company, is just understanding how much and when to share. But whole different webinar. I think one of the things that helps kind of look at unit economics is they always run into when I'm, advising companies at the operating level with the C-suite is one of the things you have to do is you have to kind of start getting everyone to track their time. And you're not tracking their time because your big brother going, oh my gosh, you're professional or you're not working and all of those things. And that's the immediate reaction of most founders. I'm not going to ask people to track their time because in fact, it's not worth it to me. But if you start tracking time, not in a punitive way, but in an informative way, you can actually start to understand the unit economics. Such a big portion of SaaS companies is labor. And if you do not know how people are spending their time, then you can't calculate unit economics. You can't calculate how much, this customer service is spending on support calls for a specific feature set, which could become a unit. You can't understand how much time product managers are, spending researching something versus if their time isn't in Jira. So you have to start finding ways that are non-intrusive, that capture how people are spending their time so that you can use it to make decisions, and not productivity decisions, not punitive decisions, but decisions on how in fact people are really spending their time. And when you're smaller as a founder, you know how everyone's spending their time because they're usually in a circle around you or you're very close to it. And as you start to scale, it's very hard to realize how people are spending their time. And so if you can start to kind of create a culture that says, let's record the time that we're spending on things, not to ad nauseum, but like enough to direct, like to have it directionally correct to make decisions. I think that's one of the biggest things that you can do as a founder, as a leadership team, or as a CEO is to start really getting into the practice of recording your time so that you can make better decisions, not for anything else. And I think that's one of the things that I've found helpful when I've kind of stepped in, when I've leading a company or stepped in to kind of help coach a company, not necessarily as a board member, because we try not to get into so much of that detail depending on the stage. But I think that's one thing you can do is when you start recording that time, that is a factor into the unit economics and calculating it, because so much of SaaS businesses are labor-based.
Maybe to add to that, like there's this L&O framework, the leverage neutral overhead framework, right? So often I'll tell my product managers, like, think about the things that you're spending time on and what they're actually contributing to the business or to the customer, right? So is this a leverage task where if I put a little bit in, I'm getting a lot more out? Is it neutral? I get as much as I'm putting in, or is it overhead and it's just admin? And you should definitely be optimizing for doing the things that are leverage tasks, right? So it's doing your own little kind of cost benefit on your time. And I think across the company, you can also apply that same lens, right? And I guess if you do know kind of where people are spending their time, then you can start to kind of like, shift them in the right direction.
What I'm hearing is gross margin. Oh, sorry, Shelly, you were going to continue.
No, you recap it. I was just reading some of the questions, so I thought, sorry.
I was going to say gross margin. I think that's probably one of the most debated topics at Series A and Series B companies, predominantly because of what you just mentioned, which is time allocation, right? How much is each different team, particularly, for instance, customer success or customer support, depending on what you label it, how much of their time is spent with directly delivering services and the solution to the customer versus actually being part of the upsell or renewal cycle?
Yeah, it is. Tracking that and kind of really understanding how you're spending your time is the way that you can really get underneath that. And I guess Alexandra put a note in there, your question, and it said, would you look at unit economics by cohort, and would each product have a different unit economics? And here's the tricky part, which I actually find why I like the scale up stage so much, is this. When you're scaling up, you have to realize that your product, your feature set, how you're selling it, who you're selling it to is changing. And because you're smaller, right, with each sale that you make, there's a material impact on each sale that you make. And we can guess how we think, our product is going to sell or how our company is going to evolve. But in fact, that changes with each sale, with each deal, with each customer that we're using. And so one of the things that you have to do is constantly slice that data in multiple ways, because today your cohort or your unit might look like this, but tomorrow it might look slightly different. And that is because your customer base is changing, the market's changing. So I wish I could give you a simple answer and say it's not just based on, yes, you could do it on cohort, but in fact, your cohort is changing, right? That's where those tools have come out, that you should be constantly looking at your cohort. As you're later stage and much larger, each individual sale doesn't have the same material impact on your units or your cohorts, but early on in the scale up phase, it has a massive impact. And so that's why I always encourage you to set up tools that, first of all, understand what you're actually tracking. And then second, set up tools that help you see how it's changing, because you can't hold it in your head as you start to scale. And you really need ways to kind of flag what's changing. And none of us can guess what's changing. That's the uniqueness of the scale up stage. We think it's going to go this way, and it slightly goes this way. And kind of getting underneath that gives you that competitive advantage.
Maybe take a step back, because I think, our audience, about 1/3 of it is traditional finance folks, and a number of product people as well. But cohort analysis, like, what is that? Because I'm hearing that pop up a lot in our conversation. What exactly is that? Who owns it? When should it be done? What should it, like, why should I care? So what does it tell me?
I will have Johan address it, but I think that if you talk to different C-suites or CEOs that have grown up through different functional functional ways they've grown up, a customer success person will say that they own it. A marketing person might say that they own it. A really good product person says they own it. Maybe not enough product people should say that they own it. And I would say that in the scale up stage of growth, the way that it typically works is that someone in your C-suite needs to be passionate about it. And often it doesn't matter to me whether it's the finance person. Typically, if they have much more of an FP&A background, it'll be them. They're looking at it, whether it's the marketing person who identifies as a marketing person or product or whoever it is. But someone has to own it and then use it to make decisions across the organization. So it really depends on who's passionate about it. But if it's not a conversation that you're having at the C-suite, and I just define the C-suite as anyone reporting to the CEO. So that's just my generic kind of term for anyone reporting to the CEO. If you're not having conversations about cohort analysis and how that should be driving some of the things that you're doing, sometimes people will call it, there's very specific definitions for cohort analysis, and I could bring them up on Google, but it's really not the point. The point is that it's really understanding who your target market is, your kind of like persona, and how does that change over time, or what are the nuances within it. So kind of really looking at a grouping of target customers and how they're acting. So it's a combination of the actual definition of the grouping of the customer and how they act. It's the combination of the two.
Yeah, so I think Shelley covered most of it. So yeah, I guess it's those characteristics that kind of bind a group of people, whether it's the time that they signed up maybe for your subscription service, or maybe it's like in the case of when we talked about the rent to upgrade users, that's a specific cohort based on the use case that they're using the product for, and seeing how those develop over time, because then you can nicely compare them with each other, and it's not really an A/B test because you're not running them in parallel, but you're also able to see how you've adjusted things, right? So like a very specific example is for us at Grover, we had a credit risk model, and we could see how cohorts perform over time based on tweaks that we made to our risk model. So we would approve certain customers based on certain criteria, and then 3 months later, maybe we changed that model slightly, and we'd see how those cohorts would perform in terms of like things like delinquency and things like that, right? So I think, but again, these concepts are tools that you can have conversations around, and I think if everyone understands them, and I think, and this also goes back to what Joyce you your mission really is to like get these executive teams to understand these concepts. And I think like step one is really, does everyone understand the language that we're talking, that we're speaking? And I think the role of the CEO and the C-level is really to make sure that's happening within their own kind of conversations, but also maybe one level down. And then the second question, and I think this is probably the linchpin, is does your data and are your analytics tools actually telling you the story they should be? And then this is like from an investor point of view, I think a lot of early stage startups, like I don't think they really know the data story. I don't think their analytics are actually, the health of the data is not there. And so to come up with these like unit economics models, I would really dig into like this is what due diligence is for, but like, are the story that they're telling in the unit economics model, is that the same one that's happening actually in real life?
Yeah, definitely. And I guess maybe just to tease out a point that Shelley's mentioned a few times. So in your experience, Johan, in working with finance, so different profiles within finance, we have some people that come from the accounting stream, some people that have come from corporate finance, banking, some people that come from ops, et cetera. So there's all these different titles, like what is a finance manager? What is head of finance, VP of finance, FP&A, RevOps, it's all mixed together. Can you share maybe like an experience of where finance has been a really valuable business partner for you and where that has not been the case?
Yeah, cool. Yeah. So yeah, I think, well, I guess a good example is when I joined Go Student, actually, my first day we did onboarding with a guy that came in for FP&A to lead FP&A. And he'd just come from Zalando, right? And Zalando understands its unit economics, right? It's an e-commerce company at scale. They've been doing this for quite a while. So when I approached him, and I said, hey, it'd be really interesting to understand like what drives the numbers here. That's always my question, is like, because I don't want to end up in a situation in an exec meeting again where we're just talking about numbers driving numbers. Like I really want to be able to like put meat behind it. Like what are the so if you think of like things like something is a basket metric like gross margin, what are the contributors to that, right? And then you can kind of have like a bit of a layered, almost like a hierarchy of metrics that drive those metrics. And what was cool is that like I said it, I spoke to him for 2 minutes and he got it right away. And he's like, and like by next week, essentially his team had already modeled this out and was working with our product team to kind of figure out what's driving what. There's actually some really cool tools to do this actually. There's I think this thing called double loop out. I've never used it actually, but you can pull in real-time analytics to show you what's driving what. So yeah, the way, I think, there's different, I think, so Shelley kind of has experience with this as well, right? Like you've got different types of profiles within a finance team. So this guy that came from Zalando really understood FP&A. But I think a lot of finance people don't come from that, like, kind of like, I call it futurism, because one day a finance person was like, actually what finance is predicting the future. And clearly that was someone more on the FP&A side of things than the accounting side. But I got really excited about finance because I was like, hey, wait a minute, I want to be a futurist as well. So I started modeling stuff out, even though I was a product person.
I guess I think I can give like maybe a good example that hopefully the crowd can understand. An accounting person, or I think first of all, when you're in the scale up stage of growth, I think the thing that you have to kind of always keep in mind is that cash is king, right? And often the first hire, cash is king, queen, whatever. Cash is the top of the food chain, and you really have to, really make sure that you have cash. But you also want to make sure that you're creating future enterprise value. And there's often times that those two things can be in, and I don't want to say conflict because you have to have cash. And often the first finance hire that you have is that someone who is watching the cash and making sure that there's going to be enough cash. And while they may want to do, scenario building or scenario planning, they're there, and there's a lot of things around cash. You're kind of, collecting, days outstanding. You're looking to, project how much is going to be in the bank, how much, talking to investors or figuring out loans, all of those things. And they take a lot of time, and it's a very specific skill set. But look, let me unfold an example. Here's where kind of understanding unit economics and kind of bridging and being able to have a conversation is this. Sometimes you can be selling a product that is going to bring more cash in. You're going to get a huge, enterprise deal. Maybe you operate in the SMB space and you've got this big whale and it's going to bring in all of this cash. And so the finance person or the accounting person who is responsible for cash is like, yes, let's bring that in. But if you don't start looking at unit economics and saying that one customer is going to bring in all of this cash, but it's going to redirect all of the effort of the R&D team to build something new to actually service that customer base. And they're not going to be able to build anything for the others. Or it's taking up a lot of time, sales time, where that same salesperson could be selling 30 of the lower price things with less risk. You have to start being able to have those conversations. And what it means is sometimes you have someone on the product side or the marketing side who's so frustrated because they can understand what's going to happen. But what they can't do is they can't bridge the difference between the conversation to say, this person, you have to understand, their job is to make sure we have enough cash. And this is going to bring us more cash. And so they get so frustrated and you create this kind of like animosity between the two groups. And if the person who's in finance would just have some empathy and understanding that this person over here has a legitimate concern, but they don't know how to speak your language and you don't know how to speak their language. And if you actually take the time instead of ignoring each other and get underneath that conversation, it may be that you're going to make the trade-off to go after that customer that is going to bring in more cash, because cash right now is the most important thing. And as a leadership team, we're going to deal with the rest and maybe have lower unit economics. But it's when you make those decisions that you've ignored each other, and you make those decisions and you go on your merry way with the same product roadmap and the same things. That's where dissonance happens. That's where things stop. And so I think it's really understanding when you're selling to that new cohort, when you're selling to that new customer that's really outside of the core thing. Yes, it's a stretch. Yes, it's a lot of cash, but it has so many cascading effects because you're creating a new unit. Even though you think my product can do all of those things, it can do things. But in fact, the bigger customers you sell to, they're assuming certain things are in your product that usually aren't there, that enterprise buyers just assume are there. So that's just a question. So I think it's understanding that they have, each person in these functional leadership roles, as you're scaling up, has something that they've got to make sure that happens. I need to make sure the cash is there. And it's how do you find ways to bridge the gap to have that finance person who maybe wasn't at the leadership role before and this functional leader who wasn't at the leadership role before realize that they both have to grow and learn how to actually communicate with each other to do good things. And it means the functional leaders need to learn finance, and the finance people need to learn patience and kind of understand how to work together to bridge that.
Maybe there's one question from Lisa Monton, which I just want to make sure is addressed. She says, to clarify, are you advocating that we should be making prioritization decisions based on unit economics?
I'm going to say yes, but Johan, you can take that.
No, I think so. Definitely. Typically the structure that we would have for prioritization and products very much lends itself to like this model, right? Usually the impact part of like an ICE score, which is like impact, confidence, ease, like how easy is it going to be to build? How confident are we that it's going to have this impact and it's that easy to build? And the impact score itself has to come from a calculation. It's not just, you don't just like kind of out of thin air say, okay, it's a 5 out of 5. It's how do you come up with that impact score? There needs to be some kind of a calculation there. And typically it's done through some kind of a time-bound goal, right? So like if you use OKRs, for example, it'll be one of the key, the objectives or key results that you're trying to drive. And so I definitely think that like, that's the unit economics are kind of the underlying foundation. The strategy kind of lays above that because the unit economics kind of dictate a little bit the strategy, because you may notice that, well, okay, your churn rate is out of control, or your CAC is out of control. So actually for the next quarter, we're going to try to reduce CAC. And then the product manager working across the different functions, trying to figure out, okay, which feature should we build next? Okay, well, we have to reduce CAC this quarter. So, that is based on the unit economics one, but the sorry, rolling over my words. The unit economics model is kind of the foundation for the strategy, which then is the foundation for the prioritization.
Yeah,
and I clarify. So that should you make decisions based on unit economics? You should make decisions. That doesn't always mean that you're gonna, I will only do this if the unit economics say it. It's that you understand what the unit economics are within your business while you're making decisions and what those trade-offs are. So I think there's a little bit of nuance in that question. And I think that there's one concept that I want to make sure that we're getting across, is that as you release a product, like, so in the early stage of scaling, you have something and it does, 10 things, right? Just out of example, it does 10 things. And you've sold that. You've sold a subscription that does 10 things. So there is value to those 10 things. And then you start to add 15 things and 20 things. The reality is that somewhere between the 10 or 15 things, right, that's actually a unit. And as your units or products mature, they tend to have super high margins in SaaS because you build them once, and they should have a very low cost to support as you scale. The issue is when you start adding 30 things to it and 35 things, and you don't start breaking it down into smaller units. And one of the things in SaaS that you want to remember is you have a revenue line, you have a cost of goods sold line, which gives you your gross margin. And inside of those things, you should have at least one unit. I'm going to call it a unit. You can call it a product. You can call it a package, whatever it is that you can get your head around. But there should be one of those that is contributing massive amounts to gross margin. Now, that doesn't mean your gross margin is huge, because you have new products or new things that are coming up that don't have the same gross margin attribution. But if you just try to keep selling all of the new stuff all of the time, you will never get the gross margin you need to actually fuel more innovation. So really understanding what that revenue and cost of goods, and then how much, below the line is actually being spent on that. Really understanding that, and knowing in that mix that you've got some that contribute high gross margin and some that contribute low. That low one is usually the one that's giving you the future value. So you really need to have both in there, and they exist in there, but it means getting into the detail and getting the data in your company that does not sit in a G&L to go get. It sits in the marketing systems. It sits in the product systems. It sits in the customer success systems. It does not feed to any G&L or any finance system that feeds to a G&L. So you have to figure out ways to get underneath that data to help you understand it. And it has absolutely nothing to do with closing the books. It has to do with making decisions on where you prioritize. Or counting cash.
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest challenges that I see with the companies we work with is and Johan, you alluded to this earlier as well, is just data. Like data hygiene, data strategy, like who does that sit with? Who is owning it? Who's making sure that everyone is speaking the same language across the board? The number of times that I've seen, marketing's definition of SQL versus sales definition of SQL being different. And then also when you go into the CRM system and you look at the pipeline and you're like, where's the data? Oh, wait, it's in this other spreadsheet. So I think that's also one of the things that's really key is making sure that there's one, the right set of data being tracked. Two, there's accountability behind that data. And thirdly, that everyone actually understands what it is that they're looking at. Johan, you look like you're
I've been in the middle of this kind of punching bag between the different functions a lot, right? Because it's because data is such a conceptual thing that half the people don't really know what we're talking about here. But we're talking about what customers are doing on your platform. That's what data is, right? And data tells a story. And I think often we just forget that because we just think that it's like a bunch of, you know, stuff that just sits in databases. But like, this is actually supposed to tell a story of what your customers are doing, and but whether from a finance point of view, from a customer experience point of view. So I think starting point is have a common definition of what these different metrics that you're tracking are, what the different data points mean, or whether, like, you know, usually a metric is a combination of data points, right? So just have like a common database or a definition library that explains from everyone's point of view what something is. What is net churn? And what are the data points that make up net churn? And have like a little excerpt of what that exactly means, so that everyone can look it up and they can all have the same understanding of what we're talking. Because that's like the starting point, to have at least have a common language that you can work, that you can speak to. Then the second, I think, is to have some kind of a workflow or a process that is like sanitized, so that when new features get built or new things get introduced in your internal workflows or external facing stuff with customers, that you have a way of like not introducing additional chaos or entropy into your data models. Because often, the first problem that often comes up is that I'll get an executive coming to me, or middle management will come to me and say, you've introduced this new feature, but you're not tracking it, and you're causing all sorts of chaos downstream, either for finance or for the data teams. So having some kind of a data audit when you're building new stuff, but then also looking back at, like, you probably have a lot of data debt as well, because you probably built a lot of stuff in the early days that you weren't tracking properly. So just having kind of like, you know, doing maybe a comprehensive audit to see, okay, are we actually, what's the health of our data at the moment, and where do we need to focus? Because no one's got it 100% accurate. I think every company, I think there's, you know, maybe 0.1% of all companies could say that they're really, like, you know, have a clean data model. And the reason for that is because then if you want to start using these real-time tools, and I mentioned data loop, like I was just mentioning to Joyce earlier, I don't think most companies could use data loop because it really requires that you have real-time access to healthy data. But I think there's a way, and I'm not from a product point of view, like I'm not like the data expert, but I've seen all of these like complex systems and different functions kind of fighting with each other. And it's really often just like a language problem to start with. Get everyone speaking the same language, have workflows and processes that make sense. And then I think you can start to address these issues.
You said that data is, you know, how the customers are using your platform. And I want to say it's also how your employees are spending your time. And partially it's because that's data as well. And so I'm just trying to address a few of the comments in there, not ignoring it, to say, I think Johan mentioned it earlier, you know, do we expose the unit economics of the company? I think if you start helping people understand that how they're spending their time is part of the data that you're using to make decisions. And one of the things that you can do is be transparent about how, if they've tracked their time and you've concatenated it and you've looked at it and you've made decisions based on it, and you start sharing that information of how you used that information, and they're not just doing it to waste their time. Because as you're scaling, you actually can't keep pace on what every single person is doing. It's just by the nature of the scaling of business, and how every person self-selects to spend their time. You want to give them autonomy and those kind of things. And it's really important to understand what that is so that you can correct. So I think that the way to kind of start putting that into your culture is to start talking about it in a way that says this is informing decisions and it's not punitive. And I think sometimes finance people, they're pretty cut and dry, and maybe it comes across as punitive. And I think that more, not always, but sometimes they go, you must start recording this because we must need it for R&D credits or whatever else it is. And if you kind of start bridging the gap, and leaders in these functional areas start kind of saying, oh yeah, you got to go do it because finance says you have to do it. And they start kind of really embracing the concept that how you're spending your time in a SaaS business is so incredibly important as you're scaling, and it's how we make future decisions. If you can start ingraining that into the culture, and not using it as punitive or dry, and then share back how it was being used, I think that has worked in the organizations that I've worked with, because most of the time I tell people to start tracking that.
I'll add to that. Like, I think often, like you said, like it feels like finance is trying to punish you for spending things or time on the wrong things, right? And I think often in product and engineering, especially design as well, you're trying to build some level of momentum, right? So you get started on something and then it snowballs and then everyone's moving in the same direction. And then finance looks at it and says, hey, this is actually probably not the thing we should be prioritizing. Maybe we should be moving more resources towards this or that. But the snowball is already rolling, and finance is usually the one that wants to stop the snowball. And they're faced with a lot of resistance, but they're trying to stop that snowball for very good reasons, right? And I think it's also the role of the product people to listen and really be kind of honest about, like, yes, we've built a lot of momentum, but potentially in the wrong direction, right? And so, and I think it's the role, especially of the C-level, to work together rather than against each other, because often the CFO will, be at odds maybe with the CPO or other people in the executive team. And I think product's role is also really to like kind of get people to empathize with, like, finance is really, they're not doing this because they're trying to be annoying or difficult, or they're doing this because this is a real issue that has good reasoning behind it. So yeah, having that level of empathy and understanding, and then being willing to stop the snowball, or maybe like bifurcate and say, hey, let's actually cut resources because we've been spending way too much on customer experience, and maybe like CAC is really like our big problem right now. So let's actually like put resources towards that and be honest about where people are spending their time. And so because I think there was a question there about like how do like the cultural implications of time tracking. I mean, we're not talking about like keystroke tracking, right? Like we're really it's really more. I mean, where I've seen it done well is that you just kind of speak with different kind of managers and try to understand where are the teams spending their time. And then it's maybe an exercise that you do every once in a while just to understand kind of where people are at. But it's not like on a data, it's not real time, like time tracking. Yeah.
I think the more that you can incorporate it to become, and again, that's, it shouldn't be the goal. You should be figuring out how to directionally get the information to make directionally correct decisions. And I think this is where sometimes an accounting brain versus an FP&A brain might come. It's like you want to make it directionally correct so that you're making the right decisions, but it doesn't necessarily have to be down to the penny. I think that is the case. I will also say this, and the example that Johan gave, which was like, the product people, they're on a momentum, and then the finance person comes in and they blame it on the finance person. And I would say this, it's like, oftentimes you make an estimate on how much you think something is going to cost to produce. And when you get into it, you find out more information that it's not bad. I think one of the things in scale up, which is much harder to do in a larger organization, is that you're going to make the best guess on how much you think something is going to cost. And when you're in the midst of it, you've got to be measuring, because if it's going way over than your original estimate, the worst thing that you can absolutely do is continue on that without surfacing the information. So I would say, back to Johan and every other product leader, as a board member, I would say it's not the finance person, the product person should have stepped up and said, this actually is costing us more than we thought, and then brought the conversation much earlier in, because sometimes you make the decision to keep doing it, but make the decision with everyone informed instead of just doing it, going on, and don't penalize that product organization or that product or R&D organization because they really made their best guess. The worst thing you can do is keep doing it when it's extremely exceeding what you thought it was going to cost in the first place, because you're starving the leadership team from making different decisions to redirect that investment to something else. So.
Yeah, and maybe to add to that, like recently I came across this concept of like looking at ease on a time scale. So when you're trying to assess you're trying to create an ICE score to prioritize something, think of how easy is this thing to build right now versus how easy will it be 3 and 6 and 9 and 12 months out? Because maybe actually you're creating a lot of debt by building something quickly, but then it's going to cost you a lot more later, right? So because your initial estimate is like at the beginning when you're building it, but you're not really thinking kind of more long term in terms of what this is going to cost the organization. And so like try to think of ease over like on a timeline, not just as a score right now. Like maybe it's a 3 right now, but maybe it's a 5 and 6 months, and so that should factor into the costs.
Yeah, I that when we talk about unit economics and something that is this unit or something that you're building, often, you see the first stages of kind of a product person understanding is how much of the allocation is R&D. And even the finance person say, well, how much of the R&D? But it's not really how much is R&D, it's how much is the R&D the one time, especially when you're talking about something with integrations. The minute that you decide in your SaaS product to support an integration, you basically have a one-time cost, and then then that product and R&D line is always going to have some portion that's going to have to be there to keep that integration active. So when you decide to add an integration, understand the unit cost of an integration is never a one-time investment. It is, even just from a product perspective, it is an ongoing investment to keep it current. And then you may also have services, to actually help your customers do it. So make sure that you're knowing that unit, it's the one-time build cost, it's the ongoing maintenance of it, and then it's how much is it going to cost to create all this, the sales material associated with it, how much is it actually going to cost to support it. And because often we're looking at, sales in isolation and product in isolation and marketing in isolation, we don't actually slice it in that unit or product or feature set. And so you actually have to do it crossways. And in larger organizations, big organizations, when you scale, they start to split into business units, and those business units start doing it. But in the early stages of scaling, you really only have one P&L. So you have to start looking at these things kind of as whatever you want to call it, shadow, side with FP&A analysis, because none of what we're talking about changes the P&L. The P&L is the P&L.
So maybe on the topic of P&L, we have one question from SVP, where he or she says, when it comes to unit economics, I like to consider CAC and LTV. For LTV calculations, often people are unclear whether to consider gross margin, revenue, or maybe even contribution margin. Any thoughts?
I think that this is, I don't know that I can answer it in 1 minute. So I will say that it depends where it sits in gross margin and different things. And especially if you have a heavy sales-led organization versus kind of a PLG, it's actually, the answer would be different. So I think that it's if you have a usage-based system and your LTV is growing through usage, you don't really have a lot of sales things that are going to contribute to the unit economics of selling it. If you're growing through kind of selling additional modules and it requires a customer success person or a salesperson to get on the phone or actually allocate different times, that's going to affect some of that gross margin. Right. So you kind of have to think about the different types of products that actually, and the go-to-market motions basically, to understand that. If you're using a partner to kind of sell and you're releasing things, that's going to be different. So I think it's really understanding. I think that I have to know more about what you're actually looking at and your product to answer that most effectively. But those are the things that affect it.
Johan, how do you think about it from a marketplace or B2B2C perspective?
So when calculating LTV, I mean, I think typically we've done it on gross margin in the past. It's actually usually done by finance in our case. But I think I guess you're looking at kind of what are the like what Shelly was saying, like what are your major kind of costs that are contributing to the so in a marketplace, I mean, like I guess R&D is a big part of it. I mean, like excluding all of the CAC, I guess, from this calculation, as far as I understand, that you're not putting CAC into LTV. But yeah, this is not kind of my domain, so I can't speak to that. Sorry.
Great. I know we have 1 minute left, so I just want to maybe end with, this is a meaty question because I don't think it's a 1 minute answer, but we'll give it a try. What are tips for enabling unit economics in the company where it is not existing today? And I'm talking about a B2B product where we have big clients and just do the work.
I think that I'm just going to answer it quickly. Is that and Danielle, I don't know in your organization. I would say someone in your organization needs to be passionate about unit economics and just start owning it, because once you get underneath it, it opens up so many discussions at the whatever leadership level. And so the way to start it is someone who's passionate about it. Often it's an FP&A person, or I would say is a product person who has financial acumen, or better yet, the two that work together. And I think that it's just starting it, right? You don't have to like build everything. Sometimes you're just doing a first spreadsheet and doing a first pass, and you kind of have these major big chunks of unit economics. But start looking at it and owning it. And what I can tell you is that success begets success, right? And I saw a post the other day, I don't know which platform it was, and it was basically a comment by Jeff Bezos, and Bezos said that the person who has the data, whoever is, even if they're the lowest level person in the organization, if they bring the data to the conversation, they are the most important person in that conversation. So I would say, if you're a leader on this call and it's not being done in your organization, I wouldn't go, let's start looking at unit economics. I'd be start presenting data in a way that is showing unit economics, and then seeing where in fact it can start to make decisions. And I'd hire someone that is working on that, or bring in an external consulting group that can kind of help you look at it, not set up the automation first, but just start looking at it. And then you'll start setting up the automation, because once you start looking at this, you're going to really see that it helps you make decisions, and it's things that you wish you knew. You probably wish you knew like 6, 12, 24 months ago. So it's really whoever in your organization has the most passion around it. Try to partner up with an FP&A finance person with an FP&A mindset, with a product person who has some financial acumen, and pair together. It's probably the fastest way to start it.
Great. Thank you so much, Shelly. I know we are completely over time, and I want to be mindful of everyone's schedules, but what I heard at the final bit is data is king, not just cash, but not just unit economics, but actually data. So with that, I wanted to also let you know that at PegaFund, we actually do have a data-driven operational scorecard that allows you to benchmark your business relative to your peers. It looks at your operational complexity, your data maturity, and also your reporting health. And it allows you to figure out how you should best prioritize your time, not just unit economics, but actually the broader finance, G&A, and business. So thank you so much for everyone. The session is recorded. It will hit your inboxes over the next day in case you'd like to watch it again. And of course, we'll also be releasing some highlights onto our YouTube channel. Thank you, Shelly. Thank you, Johan. Appreciate it.